My daughter-in-law's mother called me at 6:15 on a Sunday morning, and the first thing she said was, "You need to come get your granddaughter's things before Marcus changes the locks." I stood in my kitchen in my socks, coffee not even poured yet, and I said, "Say that again, slower." That's when I found out my son had been sitting in an emergency room since 2 in the morning with 4 stitches above his eyebrow, and nobody had called me. Not him, not his wife, nobody. It was the last time in my life I found out about something that mattered after the fact. "Hey, it's your dad here, or your uncle, or whatever brought you to this channel tonight. I don't know exactly who's watching, but I know why you're here. You're here because somebody in your family got hurt, and somebody else stayed quiet about it, and you want to know what a man does when he finds out too late. So stick with me on this one, because it's not finished the way you think it's going to finish, and if it means something to you when it's done, I'd ask you to stay around for the next one too." My son's name is Thomas. Everybody calls him Tommy, even now, even at 31 years old, because he's the kind of man who never grew out of the nickname. He's got my late wife's patience in him, which is to say he's got more patience than I ever had, and it used to worry me a little, if I'm being honest with you. When Tommy was 16, our next-door neighbor was a woman named Ruth Kowalski, 80-some years old, widowed, and every single winter Tommy would be out there at 6 in the morning before school, clearing her driveway before she even knew it needed clearing. He did it for 2 years. I only found out because Ruth mentioned it at church, casual, like it was nothing, like she assumed I already knew. Tommy never said a word about it to me. That's who my son is. He gives and doesn't ask anybody to notice. 4 years ago, Tommy married a woman named Alyssa Whitcomb, and I want to be fair here, because Alyssa herself is not the villain of this story, not exactly, not yet, you'll see what I mean. But her father is a man named Richard Whitcomb, and Richard built something real, I'll give him that. He owns 3 Ready Mart convenience store and gas station locations here in the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, and he built the first one from nothing back in the 90s. That's not a small thing, and I never disrespected him for it. What I came to understand, slowly, over 4 years of holiday dinners and birthday parties, is that Richard Whitcomb believes that anything he built, he also owns the people inside of it. And when Tommy married into that family, Richard put him to work managing the flagship location on Route 22 and made a point publicly, more than once, of calling Tommy the son I got to pick out myself. He said it like a compliment. It never sounded like one to me. I'm 63 years old. My name's Walter Doran, and I run a small fleet of delivery trucks, refrigerated trucks, mostly for grocery and restaurant supply, out of a lot in Allentown that's been in my family since my father started the business in 1968. It's not a glamorous life. You learn to read people through a windshield and a dispatch radio, and you learn that a man who yells the loudest in a room is usually the one most scared of losing control of it. I buried my wife, Carol, 6 years ago to ovarian cancer, and since then it's just been me and Tommy, and I promised myself at her funeral that I would never again let something matter to my son and stay quiet about it the way I'd stayed quiet about so many things while she was alive to smooth them over for me. I broke that promise for 4 years without even noticing I was breaking it. That's the part that still gets to me. Because here's my flaw, and I'll say it straight. I didn't want to be the interfering father. Every time I watched Richard Whitcomb cut Tommy off mid-sentence at Thanksgiving, every time I watched him correct Tommy's numbers out loud in front of the whole table, like Tommy was a teenager who'd failed a math test, I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself Tommy was a grown man handling his own marriage, his own career, and that a father who steps in uninvited does more harm than good. I believed that. I still believe part of it. But I used it as an excuse to do nothing. And there's a difference between respecting your son's independence and just not wanting the discomfort of a hard conversation. I know that now. Saturday, the 18th of October. Family dinner at the Whitcomb house, a big stone-front place out in Upper Saucon Township, with a pool they covered for the season and a kitchen island the size of my truck. I wasn't invited. Alyssa's mother, a soft-spoken woman named Diane, only ever called me for the holidays that fell on the calendar. Thanksgiving and Christmas, nothing in between. So I wasn't there for what happened, And everything I'm about to tell you, I pieced together over the following week, some of it from Tommy, eventually, once he was ready to talk, and some of it from somebody else who was standing closer to the whole thing than anybody at that table realized at the time. Dinner started at 6:30. By around 7:15, according to what I was told later, Richard had already brought up a shipment discrepancy from that week, a delivery of energy drinks that came in 12 cases, short across all 3 stores. And Richard was convinced it was a scheduling failure on Tommy's end, even though the shortage had actually happened at the distributor's warehouse, nowhere near anything Tommy touched. Tommy tried to explain that, calmly. He wasn't raising his voice. He never does. And he said something like, maybe it'd be worth calling the distributor directly, before assuming it was store-side. And Richard, this is the part Tommy could barely get out when he finally told me. Richard stood up from his own dinner table, grabbed Tommy by the collar of his shirt with one hand, and slammed the side of his face into the corner of the china cabinet behind him. That's where the stitches came from. Not a punch, not an open hand. A man twisting his son-in-law's collar and driving his head into furniture in front of his own family over 12 cases of energy drinks. Nobody at that table stood up. Nobody said a word. And Alyssa, my son's wife, the woman he'd built a life with for 4 years, looked at Tommy holding his bleeding eyebrow with his own napkin, and she said, Dad's just stressed. Tommy, you know how he gets when the numbers are off. Not, are you okay? Not, Dad, what is wrong with you? She defended the room instead of her husband, and Tommy told me later that the silence after she said it was the worst part of the whole night, worse than the blood, worse than the pain, because nobody corrected her. It was like the whole table had already decided, a long time before that dinner, that this was simply how things worked in that house, and everyone had made their peace with it, except Tommy. I want to tell you about the person who didn't let that silence be the end of it, because she matters more to this story than anybody realized that night. Her name is Patricia Nguyen. She's the operations manager across all 3 Ready Mart locations, has been for 9 years, and she was at that dinner because Richard liked having his management team around for what he called family business nights. Even though half the people at that table had nothing to do with the family and everything to do with keeping Richard's ego fed. Patricia wasn't blood. She didn't owe Tommy anything. But she got up from that table, walked Tommy out to his car with a dish towel from the kitchen pressed against his eyebrow, and while they stood there in the driveway waiting for Alyssa's mother to bring the car around to drive him to urgent care, Patricia said one thing to him. She said, Thomas, I need you to come find me Monday morning before Richard gets to the Route 22 store. There's something you need to see, and I've been sitting on it for a year because I didn't know who I could trust with it. That was Patricia. She never made noise about doing the right thing. She just quietly kept the books straight for 9 years, while a man who didn't deserve her loyalty took credit for every bit of it. When Diane finally called me Sunday morning, not Tommy, not Alyssa, Diane, because I think even she knew somebody needed to, I drove straight to the hospital where Tommy had spent half the night, even though by then they'd already discharged him, and he was back at his own apartment with 4 stitches and a headache he was trying to describe to me as, not that bad, Dad, seriously. I stood in his kitchen and I looked at the gauze taped above his eye and I said, Thomas, a man does not grab my son by the collar and put his head into a piece of furniture and get to call that a bad night. And Tommy didn't argue with me. He just sat down at his kitchen table and put his face in his hands, and I think some part of him had been waiting 4 years for somebody to say exactly that, out loud, without softening it. Here's what I didn't tell Tommy that morning, because I didn't want to hand him a hope I wasn't sure yet I could deliver on. My company, Doran Freight, doesn't just run trucks. Back in 2003, my father, before he passed, had picked up 3 commercial parcels around the Lehigh Valley as an investment, land he leased out to businesses that needed lot space and visibility on a main road. One of those 3 parcels, it turned out, sitting quiet in a filing cabinet I hadn't opened in years, was the exact half-acre of frontage that Richard Whitcomb's flagship Ready Mart on Route 22 was sitting on. My father had leased it to Richard's father back in the late 90s, back before Richard even took over the business, at a rate that hadn't moved much in over 2 decades, because my father liked doing business on a handshake and never had the stomach to push an old friend's son for a fair renegotiation. I had let my property manager, a sharp woman named Corrine Ashby, who's worked with me since 2011, handle the renewal on that lease every 5 years without me so much as glancing at the paperwork. I had never once connected the dots that the ground under Richard Whitcomb's biggest store belonged, on paper, to me. That lease was up for renewal on January 1st, a little over 10 weeks out from that Sunday morning in Tommy's kitchen. For the first few days, I didn't do anything. I told myself I was thinking it through carefully, the way a man my age is supposed to think things through. But if I'm honest with you, I was doing exactly what I'd done for 4 straight years, turning it over quietly in my head, waiting to see if it would somehow resolve on its own, the way I'd let every other slight from Richard Whitcomb resolve on its own, without me having to be the one to step in. I drove past that Route 22 store on a Wednesday, on my way to check on a delivery route, and I sat at the light out front longer than I needed to, watching Tommy's old truck parked crooked by the ice machine, and I still didn't pick up the phone. What changed it for me wasn't anger. It was the following Wednesday, when Alyssa texted, didn't call asking if he was still coming to her father's birthday dinner that weekend, since everything's fine now. Not, how's your eye healing? Not, I should have said something that night, and I'm sorry I didn't. Just, are you still coming, since everything's fine now? And that's when something in me stopped waiting to see how this would play out and started deciding how it was going to play out. I called my attorney, a man named Harold Feinstein, who's handled every contract Doran Freight has signed for almost 25 years, and I asked him one plain question. What happens on January 1st if we simply choose not to renew? Harold told me it was clean. No penalty on either side, nothing owed, nothing complicated. The lease would lapse, and Ready Mart would have 90 days under state commercial code to vacate that half-acre they'd been operating on for over 2 decades. I want to be clear with you about something, because I know some of you watching have wondered this same thing in your own situation. I never once thought about driving out to that man's house. I never considered laying a hand on him, and I want you to hear me say that plainly. What I considered was this. Richard Whitcomb built his flagship location, the crown jewel of everything he'd bragged about for 20 years, on ground that was never his, and he had spent that entire time treating the people underneath him, including my own son, like they existed to absorb whatever mood he walked in with that day. I decided he was welcome to keep building, just not on my family's dirt. I called Patricia Nguyen directly, not through Tommy. I looked up the Route 22 store's front desk number myself and asked to speak with her by name. I told her who I was, and I asked her one question. If Ready Mart lost that lot on Route 22, would she ever want to run a store of her own on that same half-acre, under a name that wasn't Richard's? She went quiet on the phone for a good 10 seconds before she said, Mr. Doran, I have been running that man's flagship store for 9 years while he stood in the doorway shaking customers' hands and taking the credit for it. Yes. God, yes. That was the whole plan, and it wasn't complicated. I wasn't setting out to destroy Richard Whitcomb. I was simply going to stop being the reason he had solid ground to stand on. Through November, the notices went out. The way notices are supposed to go out. Formal, dated, sent certified mail, exactly the 90 days required under the lease terms. I didn't call Richard myself. I let Harold's office handle every piece of it. Clean and procedural, nothing personal in a single line. Meanwhile, Corrine and I quietly started drawing up new lease paperwork, this one with Patricia Nguyen and a small business partner she'd brought in. A former regional manager from a competing chain who'd been wanting to go independent for years. Tommy was offered a real ownership stake in the new store, not a desk his father-in-law could slam his head into whenever a shipment count came up short. Richard didn't catch on right away. The notice sat in his corporate mailbox for almost 2 weeks before someone in his back office flagged it and brought it to him. When he finally understood what it meant, the calls started. 6 on a Tuesday, 11 more by Thursday. By the following Monday, I had 27 missed calls from a number I'd never bothered to save, and I knew exactly who it belonged to without having to look. He had no way of knowing, dialing me over and over like that I already knew precisely how this was going to end. I just hadn't decided yet whether I owed him a face-to-face conversation about it. I decided I did. I'm not a man who hides behind paperwork when there's a person on the other end of it. We met at my office on a Friday morning, the 21st of November, 8 o'clock sharp, because I told his assistant that was the only hour I had open that week. Richard walked in wearing a sport coat that looked like it cost more than one of my trucks, the kind of coat that's meant to remind everybody in the room who's supposed to be running things. He sat down across from my desk and said, "You're really doing this over a family disagreement," I told him. "You grabbed my son by the collar and put his head into a piece of furniture at his own wife's family dinner table, and she told him you were just stressed. That's not a disagreement, Richard. That's the reason." He tried 3 different angles on me in that meeting, same as I expect a man like that always does. First it was loyalty, that I owed him something as family. Then it was that Tommy had exaggerated the whole thing, made it sound worse than it was. When neither of those landed anywhere with me, he switched to business, told me I'd regret losing a tenant who'd never once missed a rent payment in over 20 years. My voice never went up through any of it. It didn't need to. I told him the paperwork was already final, that Patricia and her partner would be taking over that half-acre in the spring, and that Tommy would be joining them with an ownership stake, not an hourly badge. I watched something behind his eyes go still when I said Patricia's name, like it was only in that moment. He understood exactly who had been holding his flagship store together for him the whole time he'd been out front. Shaking hands, he stood up to leave, and at the door he turned around and said, "She's my daughter, Walter. Alyssa is never going to forgive you for this." I told him that forgiveness wasn't something he got to hand out on his daughter's behalf, and it wasn't something I planned to lose sleep over either way. That part I meant, every word of it. Ready Mart's Route 22 location closed its doors at the end of January. Richard tried to shift that store's operations to a smaller lot he owned across town, one without the highway visibility or the traffic count he'd built his reputation on for 2 decades. And from what I've heard through people who still talk to Patricia, it's been rough for him. I didn't lift a finger to make that part happen beyond exactly what I've already told you. I just stopped holding up a man who never once stopped to ask himself why the ground under his own feet had stayed so steady for so long. Tommy and Patricia opened the new store. They called it Doran Fuel and Market, which wasn't my idea. Tommy insisted on it in April, right where the old Ready Mart used to sit. I went to the little ribbon cutting they held out front. Tommy shook my hand at the door instead of hugging me, and I understood exactly what that meant. Some men hold themselves together by staying formal in the moment, because if they let themselves feel the whole thing all at once, they're not going to make it through the ceremony standing up straight. I shook his hand back and told him I was proud of him, and that was as far as either of us needed to take it in front of a crowd. Alyssa didn't come to the ribbon cutting. She and Tommy separated in February, about a month before the store reopened under its new name. I won't sit here and pretend that part doesn't weigh on me some nights, because it does. I didn't do any of this to end my son's marriage. I did it because I couldn't keep watching him spend the rest of his life shrinking himself down to fit inside a room his father-in-law controlled, with his fists and his money. But I'll tell you honestly, if Alyssa had stood up from that table on the 18th of October, if she'd said one word in her husband's defense, instead of excusing her father's temper, I don't think any of the rest of this would have needed to happen at all. I think about that more than I think about Richard, if I'm being truthful with you. I don't need Richard Whitcomb to apologize to me. I don't believe he's got that in him. And somewhere along the way, I stopped waiting around for people to become something other than exactly what they've shown me, over and over. They already are. What I've got instead now is a standing Saturday morning. I drive over to Doran Fuel and Market before it opens, and Tommy's already there, and Patricia's usually got the coffee going, and I watch my son walk that lot like it finally belongs to him, because it does. That's enough for me. It's more than enough, if I'm honest. It's the first time in 4 years I've watched my son stand somewhere on this earth and not brace himself for whatever might come through the door next. If this one meant something to you tonight, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and drop a like on your way out. It does more for this channel than you'd probably guess. And if any of you out there have ever had to choose between keeping the peace in your own family and standing up for your own child, I'd like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. This is your dad, signing off for tonight, and I'll see you in the next one.